Welcome to the Unhealthy Policy Podcast, where we break down how policy decisions in Washington actually play out in our hospitals, clinics, and communities.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Roach, and I'm an infectious disease doctor and researcher.
I'm Dr. Jake. I'm also an infectious disease doctor and an educator, and welcome to Unhealthy Policy. Today, we're talking about this relentless attack on science and the foundations of our scientific community. We're going to be talking about the NIH cuts and how they impact universities.
It's actually a series of cuts. There's not a specific policy, but more a series of coordinated almost attacks on the research enterprise. And those have occurred at multiple levels.
David, before we start, we had some big news in the world. White smoke finally left the conclave a couple days ago. So if white smoke left the microbiology lab, and there is a brand new pathogen that was identified, what pathogen would you hope that they find, or do you think they would find?
Jake, I just can't get the idea of megasyphilis out of my mind. So everybody's heard of the clap as a gonorrhea, but then there's drug-resistant gonorrhea, sometimes is called the thunderclap, which I think is pretty good. Nobody wants the thunderclap. But I also think of syphilis as like the word itself connotes like a large primordial kind of snake-like monster. It's got the S's in it. But I think like megasyphilis would be something that kind of would emerge from the deep, Godzilla style, and just lay waste to modern urethras throughout the world. And I think that is what I would want it to be. When the white smoke rises, megasyphilis does too.
I'm praying for only black smoke from the micro lab from now on, because I don't want megasyphilis.
I want that to be a sci-fi movie, direct-to-TV movie. I'd watch it.
Let us know in the comments what new pathogen you think they will find in the microlab. Now that we've had some fun, I think we should dive into this very serious topic.
It's important to kind of give context to how research is done in really the modern world, but specifically in America. America generates more research than anywhere else. We're a huge engine for innovation. Understanding that process from the top down is important because these current policy angles that they're taking are really trying to undercut that at every level in a systematic and coordinated fashion. And so that's what we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, and David, what we do on this podcast for those who are listening the first time is we give some background information so we have a better understanding of what these cuts mean. Because I think sometimes you hear in Washington, oh, $1 billion here, $1 billion there was cut from the NIH budget. But what does that really mean for Americans, researchers, and people who are living here? So David, just an overview, what is the NIH?
The National Institute of Health, it's many different kind of sub-institutions under that umbrella. Each one would focus on a different type of disease within people. For example, there's the NHLBI, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And then there's NIAID, which is the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease. So it's how we understand immunology, it's how we research infectious disease. And what those different institutions do is they each actually have some labs at the NIH campus. There are government scientists who are funded and are doing basic research themselves, but that's a very tiny slice of the research pie. What these agencies mostly are mechanisms to coordinate grant funding that gets sent out to research institutions and individual researchers around America mostly, but certainly around the world as well. What these places do is they seek to understand the problems within a given field. They look to coordinate ways to find solutions to those problems. And then they look to allocate funds that are dedicated to solving those problems by individual researchers. So that's the broad overview of how some of this works. It's a huge enterprise and it is responsible for a lot of advancement.
Yeah, the National Institutes of Health really is the backbone of medical research in the United States, right? It's the federal agency that funds and conducts the science behind everything from cancer treatments to vaccines to Alzheimer's research. It really started in the 1800s. So 1887, it was founded as called the Hygienic Laboratory, and then eventually was turned into the NIH as we know it in the 1930s. And it's comprised of 27 different institutes and centers, all focusing on a subset of that research. And as David said, some of this research is happening physically at the NIH, but the majority of it is going out to other institutions and individuals at those institutions to conduct their own research.
And one thing I think is really cool, the NIH and the research that it generates is an engine of innovation. The research that we generate as scientists provides the raw materials that then get translated into patient care changes or new medications, new diagnostics, new techniques. It really drives the way that we understand how the world works, but also provides the materials that industry can use to have an impact on the world in a variety of different contexts.
We should look at some very specific drugs that have been approved and have saved lives and track back where those came from. And we're both infectious disease doctors. We've both treated a lot of patients who have hepatitis C. It's such an easy treatment these days. But that was not always the case.
Before we dive in, can you tell us what hepatitis C is?
Starting out actually in the 1970s, when this new hepatitis was discovered, it was called non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis, discovered by Dr. Harvey Alter, who was at the NIH. So this is someone that was employed by the NIH, discovered that there was this new virus. Finally, in the 1980s, another doctor, Dr. Houghton, cloned the viral genome and labeled it hepatitis C. Not the most innovative name, right? We had hepatitis A, B, and now we have hepatitis C.
Jake, we're scientists. We're not marketing execs. What is hepatitis? Before we dive in, what is it? Why should we care?
You tell me.
Jake, you were my preceptor. You're the one who's supposed to be teaching. I guess you got to prove that I learned something from you.
Okay, we got to go on a little side quest here. As an educator, when David would ask me questions in clinic, I'd always say, what do you think about that first? David, what do you think about hepatitis?
Okay, so hepatitis C, it is a chronic infection where you have a virus that essentially lives in the cells of the liver. And your liver does a bunch of stuff. They say every cell has 1,000 functions or some kind of made up nonsense like that. But it is a very important organ that works to detoxify your blood. It's a very important organ, obviously. Every time I go out on a Saturday night, I really rely on my liver. So for me, it's one of the most important organs for my day-to-day function.
Right. David would rather have his liver than his brain.
Yeah. Some people would say the only reason I still have a brain is because my liver hasn't let it be fully pickled. But what hepatitis C does is it gets in the liver, and in some people, they're able to clear it right away. But in a lot of people, it sets up shop and over years and years causes a slow simmering infection. And then that infection eventually leads to scarring of the liver, which can cause cancer in some cases. And then also it can cause blockage of the flow of blood through the liver because it's scarred down. And we call that cirrhosis. And when you can't have blood flow through the liver and your liver isn't functioning as a way of detoxifying all the different things in your blood that need detoxification, it can cause a ton of problems. And people have cirrhosis, end-stage liver disease. Oftentimes, it's a kind of a fatal end-stage process. So it's a really serious disease. And in America, hepatitis C, alcoholic cirrhosis, and what we call non-alcoholic fatty liver disease were the most common causes of cirrhosis. But hepatitis C was a major player in the game. And that's not just in America, that's internationally.
And this novel hepatitis C that Dr. Alter ended up winning the Nobel Prize from. He shared the Nobel Prize in 2020 for discovering hepatitis C. So that was really the first step into eventually getting these drugs approved. 40 years later, we had to first discover the virus that was causing this disease. The next major breakthrough for hepatitis C was in the 1990s. Charles Rice, who worked at Washington University, was able to clone hepatitis C and proved that this infection actually caused the disease hepatitis. And again, this work was funded by the NIH. The next major breakthrough happened in the 1999, early 2000s, where a team in Germany and also Dr. Rice's group was able to develop a system where they could replicate hepatitis C in cells. And then this allowed to test drugs on that replicating virus. Without that platform, that backbone of science, these drugs would have never been discovered.
So, Jake, we have that platform, we have that background and allowed us to make the drugs. What are the drugs that we have available now? How have they changed the game?
We used to have old drugs called interferon that were terrible. Patients got extremely sick. And then in the early 2000s, because of this research that I mentioned before, scientists were able to develop what are called direct-acting antivirals. And the earliest one was called sofosbuvir. This actually comes from a researcher at Emory and also at the VA. So again, more nationally funded research. His early work, which was supported by NIH grants, targeted a specific enzyme that hepatitis C used to replicate. He created a biotech startup for these oral HCV drugs. He eventually built up this company, named the drug sofosbuvir around 2007. And then that specific company he sold to a larger drug company because these larger drug companies have the platform to do these large clinical trials. And then eventually in 2013, this drug was put on the market after it succeeded in its clinical trials. And now anyone who has hepatitis C can take a medication for 8 weeks and they're cured of their hepatitis C, preventing all of these downstream effects like liver fibrosis and cirrhosis that David was talking about earlier.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. It's actually very easy to treat a patient who has hepatitis C now. Honestly, you don't even really need to think about it. You just run a couple tests, choose the drug, and then their hepatitis C gets cured, which is a miracle compared to where people were 40 years ago. It's wild how much progress we made in that regard.
Yeah, and just to quickly summarize, that's a long, convoluted story. But at the end of the day, the NIH funded the research to figure out what hepatitis C was, to figure out how to replicate it in the lab, to figure out what the initial molecules were that could inhibit it, and then to do the very early toxicology studies. It set up this perfect system so that eventually one of these larger drug companies could get it out to the public. The NIH didn't give this money directly to any of these drug companies. It was giving it to this cohort of scientists who developed the platform for this drug to be eventually developed.
Yeah, and they're funding the research, and it's hard to know where the research is going to take you. But what is truly remarkable is all of us benefit from having that drug available. The entire world benefits because the NIH did this research, and a ton of Americans benefit.
So, David, was this a one-off? Maybe this is like the one highlight example of research coming to a drug. Tell us a little bit more in general about all the new drugs that were released in the past decade. Where did those come from? Do you have some stats on that?
It's pretty remarkable to think about how widespread the influence of the NIH is. And we're focusing on drugs here because I think it's like an easy thing to conceptualize and wrap your heads around. But this same principle applies for essentially every advance in medicine. So there's this really cool paper that I'm referencing here, and we'll pop it up. But between 2010 and 2019, the NIH funding contributed to 99.4% of new drug approvals. That's 354 out of 356 new drugs were developed because of research that came out of the NIH. And in 2010 to 2016, all 210 of the new drugs, every single one, came from NIH-funded research. And this is not saying that the NIH is like creating the drugs. The NIH is doing the basic research that is the raw material that allows this innovation to happen. The NIH generates the knowledge that we use to advance. And I think that is a really key point.
We've been using the term basic science. What does it actually mean when we say basic science?
Basic science is where you try and understand the building blocks of how the world works. How does a tiny little problem that we think impacts people, how does that function? What do we need to understand to not only get at the mechanism of what that is, but how we can intervene to block the mechanism or to enhance the mechanism or whatever the question is. But what are the fundamental workings? That's what basic science is. And understanding that leads to a lot of downstream effects that are very difficult to predict. And it takes decades to sometimes for the basic building blocks to be understood and then the effects to occur. And the graph that we're showing right now demonstrates that a lot of these drugs take up to 20 years to develop from the time that the fundamental mechanisms are understood. And really importantly, the sun is starting to shine. The weather is starting to clear. People are starting to get outside, and it is bikini season, Jake. I don't know if you know that.
Not yet. I got another month. I'm still working, man.
Okay. So bikini season is upon us or near upon us. And I think that's relevant because I want to talk for a second about Gila monsters and lizard saliva. And
why are we doing research on lizards? Cut all lizard research.
Megasyphilis is coming, Jake. We need something to fight megasyphilis.
David, why are we talking about lizards on this podcast?
So a lot of people already know this, but Wegovy, Ozempic, all of those fall under the banner of GLP-1 agonists. And everybody knows now that they help with weight loss and with helping people look snatched, like a 4 or a 5 on the CAT scale. They have a ton of health benefits for people with diabetes, people with heart disease, and a variety of other things. We're finding more and more out about the benefits of them. But why do they matter? What happened is that back in the 1970s, we started to understand the hormones that regulated some of these metabolic conditions. And then once we figured out those hormones, they were rapidly broken down. And then researchers were looking to find more long lasting ones. And they found one of those hormones in the Gila monster saliva, just through basic science, looking at a question from a very fundamental level that doesn't have a clear human impact yet, but is trying to get at these fundamental building blocks of how we can intervene on our understanding of how the world works. And then that led to the development of long-acting GLP-1 agonists that change how people want to eat, that have effects on diabetes, heart disease, et cetera.
So you're telling me if I get bit by a Gila monster, I'll be perfect for bikini season?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. You're very astute, Jake. I think you got to get yourself a Gila monster and let her rip. Do not do that at home. But all of that fundamental basic research was done through the NIH type mechanisms. And what I think is important is that 50 years ago, when some of this research was started, it was impossible to predict the myriad of ways that it would have benefit now, 50 years later, where it's not only like changing people's lives for the better, I believe that, but also is a huge economic engine for the country.
If we eliminate the obesity epidemic, which I think we're well on our way of doing, healthcare costs are going to go way down. Less heart disease, less cancer, less pretty much everything. So what I'm hearing you say, David, is that back in the 1970s, when this molecule was first being looked at, no one could have envisioned that it was going to be used in weight loss. And I think, just to reiterate, when you're doing the foundational science, you're not sure what path the science is going to take you. If you're one of these large pharmaceutical companies, you may be thinking 10 years down the line, maybe 20 years down the line. You're not thinking 50 years down the line. You're not doing this basic science research where it might go nowhere. There's plenty of examples where research went down a path and then it didn't end up working. So I think exactly what you said, the NIH and the other kind of institutes that we're talking about really lay down this foundation to allow these drug companies to produce the drugs that they do. David, in the study that you mentioned, 354 out of 356 drugs were created based on NIH research. What were the two that weren't?
Oh, I have zero idea.
A laxative, nothing against constipation, but an osmotic bowel cleansing laxative. And the second is an iron chelating agent when you have transfusion overload in a certain bloodborne disease, which I'm sure is very helpful to some people, not minimizing that. But those are the only two drugs in the past decade that were approved without any type of NIH research.
Wild. Genuinely wild. Every cancer drug, every infectious disease drug, every autoimmune drug, all done on the back of NIH research. To be clear, this is research funded by the NIH. So a lot of individual scientists in institutes around the world, but mostly in America, doing this basic research funded through NIH mechanisms.
So the guy at Washington University wasn't employed by the NIH. He applied for grants, got the money. The institution technically gets the money to fund his salary, to fund the equipment that's needed, to fund his research assistants. That's really what was happening. It's wild.
And also just to think like what we're doing now, it's certainly having impacts on us. Me as a researcher, it's having direct impact on my life. But what we're really doing is we're cutting out the positive benefits that this research will have on our kids, on our grandkids, on people around the world in 20, 30 years.
Imagine in the 1970s, if the government said no more research on viruses, we wouldn't have discovered hepatitis C. And then who knows where we would be today.
This is impacting the generations to come in ways that we can't even fathom.
These examples keep popping up into my head as we're talking about this. I want to talk just 2 seconds on HPV. So HPV is a virus. When the person that was discovering this virus figured it out, they had no idea the downstream effects that an HPV vaccine was going to have on their grandkids. So about 20 years ago now, scientists developed an HPV vaccine. So a vaccine against a virus. HPV is the virus that causes cervical cancer in women, head and neck cancers in men and women. It's recommended now that all adolescents get the HPV vaccine. That vaccine has now prevented thousands of cases of cervical cancer. The rates are just plummeting in women. And I think this is a great example of how that researcher, their granddaughters are now not getting cancer because of the research they did that was never going to be predicted 40 years ago when this was discovered. There's just countless examples of this, and people take it for granted.
Yeah, they were like looking at guinea pigs, cervical smears, like the Poppy Nicolau test was like
No
looking at
guinea
guinea
pig
pigs.
research.
No guinea pig research, no lizards, no guinea pigs. Cut it all. So let's talk about that, Jake. What are the cuts? What's going on? What
I had
is
no fucking
happening?
clue, David. I had no clue. It's crazy, man. I'm only joking a little bit. It's crazy.
It's true. So I think what's important to think about is how we've discussed some of the layering down from the national level down to the individual lab level. And there really are systematic cuts at every single level. There are tens of billions of dollars in cuts that are expected across the NIH. Up to 35% of the NIH's entire budget is on the chopping block. That money doesn't go to the NIH. That goes to the different institutions in America that are the gold standard for how research is done across the world. This enormous cut into the research enterprise in America leads to all of these different institutions to lose their access to funding. And that has direct, of course, economic impacts on individuals, but it also destabilizes the entire academic enterprise in America and therefore the world. America is by far
Yeah,
the biggest researcher in the world.
this research is expensive. I don't think anyone's going to doubt that. To the tune of about $47 billion per year was the old NIH budget. President Biden had asked for an increase for the upcoming year. And then when this current administration came in, really slashing the NIH budget, we're not sure by exactly how much, but about 50%. So getting down somewhere into the $25, $27 billion range. And I think the other thing that you've mentioned is it's also a shift in priorities. So some of the research now that they're pushing may not be what the individual scientists are wanting to focus on. I think we have some examples, David, of individual research projects or grants that were just totally cut. Do you want to talk about some of those?
A lot of the things that have been most directly in the line of fire have been research around marginalized communities and LGBTQ type research. Obviously, we talked about the impacts in PEPFAR, so anything that is taking place in the global health setting where there's a huge need, those areas are all getting cut. And the research that funds a lot of those international projects is getting axed. So what they've focused on right now so far are the most marginalized communities, oftentimes who suffer the greatest. But the chainsaw is coming to everywhere else soon as these new budgets come.
A lot of these grants, the researchers already were approved to get this money. And these grants, the research take sometimes 5 years. Those were just stopped. People in the middle of experiments and middle of clinical trials, those were just completely stopped.
Yeah, there's no doubt people were receiving stop work orders when they were investigating the mechanisms of tuberculosis. It kills hundreds of thousands of people a year. It's a major global killer. It absolutely will continue to spread around the world if we don't do treatment and containment and diagnosis as part of like our standard pathway. And further researching better ways to do that is key. And they just sent stop work orders on that.
And the other one is vaccine uptake. So it's sometimes hard for people in rural communities to access vaccines. All that research was just canceled. Vaccine research itself was canceled. So we talked about preventing cancer with the vaccine. All these things that potentially could happen were just abruptly cut. So David, the other group of grants that were canceled was not just by the topic, which we've just talked about, but also by who was doing the research. So this current administration has canceled pretty much all grants at Columbia, pretty much all grants at Harvard University. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that's going to affect America?
Absolutely. The administration has developed a plan to really attack what they consider to be elite institutions. Oftentimes, those are Ivy Leagues or some Ivy League adjacent type places. These institutions are huge drivers of research around the world. The reason that these places have a good reputation for doing research is that they do a lot of it. They are the major centers for research, really in a global context. And people call them like the jewels of the American research enterprise because so much research is done here. And importantly, this research is not done by like pointy headed elites who are like sitting in an ivory tower doing whatever. These are people who are some of the hardest working scientists, some of the people who care
Nerds.
the most, some of the people who are the most dedicated nerds, who care the most about these subjects. They work their entire lives putting endless effort into developing their research skills in order to work at some of these places because they have access to funding, because they're around other researchers. But these are people who grind so hard for research. They grind so hard to advance knowledge. And then they're just cut out because of some type of political misconception about what occurs. To me, it's mind boggling.
David, you're exactly right. One of the research projects that was cut was a very well-known researcher who was looking at ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, really coming up with new treatments for this progressive, debilitating illness. And I just don't want our medical research to be pawns in some political struggle. I don't pretend to be an expert knowing what the Trump administration is thinking or what Harvard is thinking, but this battle between the Trump administration and Harvard around protesters, why should that impact ALS research? That doesn't make any sense to me. Use something else as a bargaining chip as opposed to the health of our country. It's just so frustrating.
And to your point, Jake, it is mind boggling that we cancel tuberculosis research because the Trump administration disagrees with Harvard University's DEI policy. That doesn't compute that we cancel foundational life-saving research because people want to promote LGBTQ rights to be able to wave a rainbow flag at campus. Like, that is insane. Those things are
Right.
not the same.
I think we have to say this again. So the policy from the current administration, and all the people in research got this letter, the institutions got this letter that said that if your institution, so if Harvard has any DEI policies, they can't get any funding research for cancer, can't get any funding research for Alzheimer's. Not that you can't get research for DEI programs. You can't get money for, I'm just like getting caught up in the words because it's so infuriating that someone would use the health of America as a bargaining chip to get their way.
On May 5th, Linda McMahon, who's the ex or maybe current wife of Vince McMahon, famous WWE promoter. So everybody who's a WWE fan, I get it. But Linda McMahon, our current National Secretary of Education, or whatever the term is, she sent a letter to Harvard on May 5th that says that they will not get any new grants for any research. The world's largest research institution that has developed so many life-saving medications, so many life-saving interventions, multiple Nobel Prizes, even recently for having a huge impact on the world at large, that is doing research on TB, one of the largest cancer researchers in the country. They will get no funding for any of this until they allow the government to take over their determination for who gets admitted, or which kind of DEI initiatives they promote, and who gets to have decision making at the institutional level within Harvard. They are holding the entire research enterprise hostage because of their perspective on some of these issues that have absolutely nothing to do with the research at hand. It's insanity. It's like holding a gun to a kid's head because you don't agree with their parents' lawn mowing techniques and whether they have flamingos in their front yard. So they're like, okay, you're going to put lawn gnomes in your front yard? I'm going to hold a gun to your kid's head and say, sorry, that's the choice you have to make. And that's what we're doing. Obviously, that's an extreme example, but that is the real result of how this is playing out. And I think we should all just be very clear about that. And the real question is one of control. Fundamentally, the current administration wants control over the global research enterprise and even removing research because scientists are going to build facts, and those facts might get in the way of what the current administration is advocating for. And so they're holding that entire research enterprise hostage until they can say, you know what, we'll just do whatever you say. We'll do whatever research you want. We'll make up whatever facts you think are true. and we'll get our funding. That's what they want. And we need to push against that as researchers. And fundamentally, we need to acknowledge that's the game being played and that all of us, the entire world, are losers.
We invest so much, or historically invested so much in research that benefits Americans, but it also benefits the world. And at the end of the day, we should be doing that, right? We should be sharing this wealth of knowledge with the world. So, David, I want to talk a little bit about the specific numbers about grants that were already in process that have been cut. Because this is one of the specific policy pieces, not only the NIH budget in future years going down, but promised money being taken away. So as of an article from May 8th, $1.81 billion in medical research funding has been cut. That is 694 grants covering $1.81 billion. A lot of those grants are in infectious diseases, in mental health, and health disparities, as we previously talked about. I think one piece we talked about earlier is how America does so much research, it's really hard for other countries to pick up the slack. And one example of this is with all these cuts, Europe came out to try to attract researchers to the European Union and said they're going to have $500 million of new research. It just pales into comparison, right? That's not even covering all the grants that were cut in the past 6 weeks. And it's really hard for any one institution or any one group to make up this deficit.
People are going to step into the breach because there are a lot of scientists who are normally drawn to America. America is this beacon of science where people come from all over the world to participate in the research endeavor here. It's like the research dream. And other countries are going to start siphoning off that talent. And China is going to start siphoning off that talent. And they already are. And I think it's a smart thing for them to do. I'm very happy to hear that places like the EU, who are liberal democracies, who I believe in, are bringing in some of that research talent. But the real thing is America is handicapping ourselves here. We are totally kneecapping American innovation, and we are totally kneecapping America's ability to stand at the head of the table and have an impact on the world. It's just,
David,
it's mind-numbing.
Yeah, it's actually crazy. So United States, we used to get the best and the brightest of researchers from around the world who would want to collaborate with the United States, who had to come to the United States and actually do this groundbreaking research. People are coming over on visas. We're not going to get into immigration policy here, but those people aren't coming here anymore. And then the second thing is even Americans, I know of a couple of my friends actually, who are in the process of going to Europe or going to other countries, who were born and raised and educated in America, and they're doing their research elsewhere because that's where the money is, that's where the support is, and that's where the funding is. And I think it's just such a short-sighted mistake to kneecap America as we've done here.
Beyond the researchers themselves, I have a friend who is an entrepreneur type. He works at a venture capital firm where they actually try and start new companies that advance different things in science that researchers have developed. And I was getting a drink with him a couple nights ago. He makes a mean cocktail. He was telling me how he'd been working for months and months on these plans to build this new company, working with American research to do it. And all of that just ended because the markets got so roiled, because there's such a lack of investment in the American research enterprise now. And that's already impacting the business environment that would grow from this. Those kinds of advancements and that kind of innovation and those companies are no longer going to be looking to do business here. They're going to be looking elsewhere. So this is just harming us on all levels.
Think about the hepatitis C drug. That research was done in America. An American company was started, a small pharmaceutical company, and then was sold to a larger American company who's then generating all this revenue, employing all these people. Now imagine if the number of new drugs drops in the United States and they're all in Europe or elsewhere. Those are the countries that are going to be benefiting from it. We started this episode with a joke about the white smoke coming up from the conclave.
There's just smoke rising from everything. Everything's on fire.
Most of it's black smoke, but everything's on fire. I'm not a Catholic, but for the longest time, it was thought that you would never have a pope from a world superpower because you wanted to separate the church from the world superpowers. And I think it's fitting that an American pope was picked. I think that may be foreshadowing where we're going if these cuts continue and the path we take continues.
Yeah, Americans a superpower because its people work hard. We have a lot of resources and we have invested in American ingenuity and innovation. We lead the world in technological advancement and that's going to go away. I don't get it, but that's where we're at. And it's being done right now for what seem to be petty reasons, but I think there is a larger kind of playbook that's being enacted. And we don't want to get too political in this podcast, but I do think it's worth paying attention to some of that rationale.
We don't want to get too political, but when politics is impacting the health of current America, the health of future America, we have to get involved. And I think that's been one issue is a lot of people out there are like, oh, I don't follow politics. I'm not into politics. That's fine. But are you into the health of America? Are you into the future health of America? Do you want this science to continue? And if the answer is yes, then you have to see what's going on in Washington. Their priorities right now have nothing to do with science. If anything, it's anti-science. It's not even an ambivalence to science. It's anti-science. So David, it is time for your favorite segment of the podcast.
Where we have a drink
and for those
before 11?
Yeah, it's 10:59. I got my coffee going. But you could probably see I'm a Cleveland fan. This is for the Guardians, but my beloved Cleveland Cavaliers have not been doing well in the playoffs, so it's been a hard time. And for those in Boston, also the Celtics have not been doing so hot either.
Just can't win for you, Jake. What a loser. All Americans are losers.
I just
right
lose.
Now,
I'm just losing. Loser. I need to win. I'm the biggest loser, seriously. So David, it is now time for your favorite segment of our podcast.
The DDCUs?
And that is the DDCUs. So David, what is a DDCU?
So the Dunkin' Donut Coffee Unit. It is how many small Dunkin' Donuts an individual person in America, each American, has to give up over the course of 1 year to fund this policy.
Policy we're talking about today in this segment is the cuts to grants that were already established. So all that funding that was already happening that got cut off, and that was $1.8 billion. So how many DDCUs is that?
So a Dunkin' Donuts coffee, small black, about $3.50. There's about 330 million Americans. So roughly it's one DDCU per $1 billion. And so that's each American giving up 1 cup of coffee per year. And so in order to fund all of this research that is going on, each American would have to give up less than 2 cups
unhealthy policy,
small black coffee per year in order to fund this incredible life-saving research. And
this is, we're not talking about the entire NIH budget here, but we're talking about what's been cut, right? All the vaccine uptake, all the disparities research that David talked about. But it's just incredible how Americans don't have to give up that much. It doesn't cost that much when you individualize it to get this science done.
Yeah, genuinely. This is a small investment by each individual American for a huge payoff for us as a country and as a world.
David, now it's time for my favorite segment.
Oh, Jake, tell me about your favorite segment.
So my favorite segment on this podcast is it healthy or unhealthy? We're going to go to both of us and say what really stuck out from this episode and whether we think that's a healthy or unhealthy policy. David, why don't you go first?
For me, what is especially unhealthy about this is the lack of reliability. So we are removing grants. We are cutting things that people were relying on. We are clearly deprioritizing the scientific enterprise in America. And so sure, that's going to have some immediate impacts in the science that we're doing. But the longer term impacts of absolutely gutting investment in research and really taking away scientists' confidence in the American vision is something that is very damaging over the long term, and it's going to take a long time to come back from.
Mine is similar. Science builds on itself. The researchers stand on the backs of the scientists before them. The institutions are continually evolving, investing in this research pipeline. And by slashing all of this, it just is going to dramatically cut that pipeline, cut that infrastructure. I'm not sure what the rabid raccoon out there might be the cure for something in 20 years. No.
It's probably going to be like
right?
caterpillar urine that ends up curing all cancer. And we don't know. We're not going to figure it out.
Right. That molecule exists somewhere in the world right now that's going to cure the next breakthrough for cancer. And I think it's so hard to anticipate what the basic science research is going to lead to in the future. And the fact that 99% of all drugs approved in the United States were funded at some point by NIH dollars, and we're just going to gut that, it's just going to have devastating consequences for everybody. I just can't get over how short-sighted this is to save a couple coffees. It's ridiculous.
All right. What's that? Thanks, everybody. My name's David Roach. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this point, and we hope to talk to you soon about something else horrifying that I'm sure is happening as we speak.
And my name's Jake, another infectious disease doctor. I hope you guys all have Gila Monster pets.
Gila Monster, Jake.
Gila. Oh, Gila. Gila?
Gila.
I've always thought it was a G.
I tell you
Gila.
what, the student has become the master.
I'm dumb. I'm dumb. All right, on that note, take care.